In fact, those that we call the 5 civilized tribes in the southeast United States, which were actually given that name due to their adoption of many European cultural values, to include centralized forms of representative government, conversion to Christianity, education and literacy, intermarriage with whites, and, of course, their participation in the ownership of black slaves. Much of this cultural assimilation was due to the belief by the tribes that if they acquiesced and adopted European methods, then they would not be persecuted themselves and pushed off their lands. These Native American groups primarily included the nations in the southeast, such as the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw Creek, and Seminole tribes. Ironically, only the Chickasaw and Choctaw failed to free all of the people they held in captivity until 1866, after the Civil War, when the federal government had to step in. By the 18th century, many Native Americans owned black slaves, and some tribes, such as the Catawba and Cherokee, were notorious for their dislike of blacks. Hence, their slaves were not normally assimilated, but worked like common laborers under often harsh conditions. The Cherokee were also famous for owning the largest number of black slaves purchased from white slave traders in the colonial period. It is recorded that in 1809, the Cherokee owned nearly 600 black slaves. Another unique fact was that the Cherokee Constitution did not recognize the children of black women as members of the nation. The Cherokee did not recognize formal marriages between their people and the black slaves in the Cherokee Act of Union in 1839, and this was revised in 1855. Those slaves who returned after the Civil War were denied Cherokee citizenship, although Cherokee Chief Lewis Downing tried to legally correct this, but he was overruled by the National Council, and the Cherokee National Legislature called upon the federal government to remove what they called the intruders. However, it should be noted that there was a sect within the Cherokee called the Ketowa Society, which was a secret abolitionist organization that ran its own underground railroad and protected runaway slaves. The Chickasaw produced cotton, corn, tobacco, livestock, and poultry for self-consumption, but also to sell on the open market to white Americans. Their use of black slave labor assisted in these projects, being that they were an agrarian-based economy. The Chickasaw also gave greater value to white mixed members over those who were black mixed, and in their culture, white mixed Chickasaw often became chiefs, but that was not part of the program for the black Chickasaw. In an effort to stop race mixing, Chickasaws were publicly punished for having relationships with blacks. They were subjected to fines, whippings, and often expulsion from the nation. The Creek Nation had many interactions with blacks, and some took runaway slaves into their protection, although they still considered them inferior due to the type of field work that the men had to do on the plantations. Many blacks would become Creek slaves, or in some cases the Creeks would sell the runaways back to their white owners. During the 18th century, after the American Revolution, the whites placed bounties on runaways. In most cases, the Creeks refused to comply with the white demands for their return. During this period, few Creeks owned black slaves, but by the 1850s this changed, and after the Great Relocation West, where it is estimated that 10% of the Creek Nation were black slaves. The Choctaw in Georgia, in their 1840 Constitution, did not allow freed blacks or runaways to settle within Choctaw territory, meaning that they were not allowed to own land. But white men could and often did get permission in writing from the tribal chief or United States agent in charge to live within the Choctaw Nation. Blacks or their offspring were not allowed to become citizens of the nation or hold office, but this was not true of Choctaw white men married to Choctaw women, and their children were considered members who could then become citizens. The Choctaw also began to have an abrasive relationship with the Christian missionaries who arrived and built churches and schools, and this was tolerated until the missionaries began preaching that slavery in its entirety was antithetical to Christian values. Then the missionaries were politely told to leave. The Choctaw, like the majority of white slave owners, did not want their slaves literate. Most of the Indian slave owners had many of the chiefs of the various tribes who were themselves mixed race, living in both the world of the Indian and the white man.